Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 175, where we read and review philosophy live on air. So, we're doing philosophy of race, but maybe we'll do one of philosophy of gender because, it is Pride Month, although we've been doing race because of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and America. So let me put the volume down on this just a little bit more. So this version of this, I think, is just a little bit louder. But I'm starting to get into a few years back in the philosophy of race stuff I have access to, so I was thinking maybe do something different. Alright, let's get down to gender. Let's see what we got here. The other thing, I might do, the other thing is do a classic paper by W.E. Actually, you know what I can do? Let's look at a classic paper by what's it called? Conservation of Races? Is this the right paper? Okay, I think this might be it. Okay, so you know what? We'll do this classic paper instead, and it'll be interesting. This is my only classic paper I think I've ever critical philosophy of race. Check out this journal. First time I think done this. Alright, actually, you know what? Let's see. Is there a e-text? And then we can do maybe a little bit better formatting here. Let's zoom in so it's a bit more reasonable. This looks like a reasonable thing to read. Okay, so let's try and read this. So this is the first time I've done a classic paper, or I don't even know what year is this. I mean, how classic is classic? 1897. So yeah, this may be among the oldest things this is the oldest thing I've ever read. Burghardt Du Bois. Okay, announcement, no announcements. There's no abstracts. The conservation of races. The American Negro has always felt an intense personal interest in discussions as to the origins and destinies of races, primarily because back of most discussions of race with which he is familiar have lurked certain assumptions as to his natural abilities, as to political, intellectual, and moral status, which he felt were wrong. He has consequently been led to deprecate and minimize race distinctions, to believe intensely that out of one blood God created all nations, and to speak of human brotherhood as though it were the possibility of an already dawning tomorrow. Nevertheless, in our calmer moments, we must acknowledge that human beings are divided into races, that in this country the two most extreme types of the world's races have met, and the resulting problem as to the future relations of these types is not only of intense and living interest to us, but forms an epoch in the history of mankind. It is necessary, therefore, in planning our movements and guiding our future development, that at times we rise above the pressing but smaller questions of separate schools and cars, wage discrimination and lynch law, to survey the whole question of race in human philosophy, and to lay on a basis of broad knowledge and careful insight those large lines of policy and higher ideals which may form our guiding lines and boundaries in the practical difficulties of every day. For it is certain that all human striving must recognize the hard limits of natural law, and that any striving, no matter how intense and earnest, which is against the constitution of the world, is vain. The question, then, which we must seriously consider is this: what is the real meaning of race? This is the first time it's been capitalized here. What has in the past been the law of race development, and what lessons has the past history of race development to teach the rising Negro people? We thus come to... you know what I did not do now that I realized? Alright, so I'm on page 6 here, but, because I'm doing a classic paper, I forgot. You do anything different, and all of a sudden you get all twisted and get messed up, and you get yourself confused. So if you want the link to this, it's right here. You can always type !paper in the chat box, and the link will pop back up. Please ask questions along the way. This is as I said, this is the first time I've done a classic text, if anything, and we'll see how it goes. I feel weird, it's I don't mind criticizing contemporary people in some sense. Criticizing people that are people have, besides the author, of course, are emotionally invested in certain texts. I mean, philosophers are just like everybody else; they get emotionally involved, and so criticizing someone like unjustly is still makes people angry with you. So in some sense, like if I insult a contemporary author, their feelings might be hurt, their friends' feelings, but it's like no big deal. You criticize a classic author, maybe like you get a whole like tradition angry with you. I mean, how much wrath of people do I want to incur here? Who knows? Anywho, when we thus come to inquire into the essential difference of races, we find it hard to come at once to any definite conclusion. Many criteria of race differences have in the past been proposed as color, hair, cranial measurements, and language, and manifestly in each of these respects human beings differ widely. They vary in color, for instance, from the marble-like pallor of the Scandinavians to the rich dark brown of the Zulu, passing by the creamy Slav, the yellow Chinese, the light brown Sicilian, and the brown Egyptian. Men vary too in the texture of hair, from the obstinately straight hair of the Chinese to the obstinately tufted and frizzled hair of the Bushman. In measurements of heads, again, men vary, from the broad-headed Tartar to the medium-headed European to the narrow-headed Hottentot, or again, in language, from the highly inflected Roman tongue to the monosyllabic Chinese. All these physical characteristics are patent enough, and if they agreed with each other, it would be very easy to classify mankind. Unfortunately for scientists, however, these criteria of race are most exasperatingly intermingled. Color does not agree with hair texture, for many of the dark races have straight hair, nor does color agree with the breadth of the head, for the yellow Tartar has a broader head than the German, nor again has the science of language as yet succeeded in clearing up the relative authority of these various contradictory criteria. The final word of science so far is that we have at least 2, perhaps 3 great families of human beings, the whites, the Negroes, possibly the yellow race. That other races have arisen from the intermingling of the blood of these 2. This broad division of the world's races, which men like Huxley and Rachel have introduced as more nearly true than the old 5-race scheme of Blumenbach, is nothing more than an acknowledgement that, so far as purely physical characteristics are concerned, the differences between men do not explain all the differences of their history. It declares, as Darwin himself said, that great as is the physical unlikeness of the various races of men, their likenesses are greater, and upon this rests the whole scientific doctrine of human brotherhood. Okay, so basically here it's saying, look, if you try to break it down in a science way, everything gets too intermingled to actually get yourself in a hard saying, like, okay, here's the thing that does, here's the thing that makes someone different from one race or another, because everything's intermixed. Of course, they didn't have genetics at this time, but of course, if you do the genetics, you get the same problems. There's nothing special about this argument, even though this is in the science of the day. The science of the modern day doesn't do anything else, does not go against this. So even though it's sort of a old-fashioned scientific argument, the argument hasn't changed, which is interesting. Because like the you can always like swap around, like, oh, you can swap this gene to here, and it doesn't make any difference. So you can mix all this stuff together, and there's still people. Okay, although the wonderful developments of human history teach that the grosser physical differences of color, hair, and bone go but a short way towards explaining the different roles which groups of men have played in human progress, yet there are differences, subtle, delicate, and elusive though they may be, which have silently but definitely separated men into groups. While these subtle forces have generally followed the natural cleavage of common blood, descent, and physical peculiarities, they have at other times swept across and ignored these. At all times, however, they have divided human beings into races, which, while they have perhaps transcended scientific definition, nevertheless are clearly defined to the eye of the historian and sociologist. Alright, so now we've moved beyond the biology and physics or whatever. So more of a social science, I guess. If this be true, then the history of the world is the history not of individuals, but of groups, not of nations, but of races, and he who ignores or seeks to override the race idea in human history ignores and overrides the central thought of all history. What, then, is a race? It is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life. Okay, so this is, even so, I mean, you gotta think, once you get into this historian sociologist, you're talking about, I mean, how far back you're going. I mean, assuming you're going to go with the Darwinian story of things, we've been human for about 2 million years, or at least about there. That's when, like, modern humans have been around. And so it's like somewhere in the less than 2 million years or whatever, probably a lot shorter than that, is where history and sociology sort of pick up. And that's where the races may have diverged, somewhere in that time period. So this is not like all of history, but it's like this is what sort of matters to us. So it's an interesting, so you guys just to keep in mind. So what was the meaning of real history then? That's kind of where I'm getting at. Turning to real history, there can be no doubt first as to the widespread, nay, universal prevalence of the race idea, the race spirit, the race ideal, as to its efficiency as the vastest and most ingenious invention for human progress. We who have been reared and trained under the individualistic philosophy of the Declaration of Independence and the laissez-faire philosophy of Adam Smith are loath to see and loath to acknowledge this patent fact of human history. We see the pharaohs, Caesars, Toussaints, and Napoleons of history and forget the vast races of which they were but epitomized expressions. We are apt to think in our American impatience that while it may have been true in the past that closed race groups made history, that here in conglomerate America, we got some French or something, we have changed all that and have no need for this ancient instrument of progress. This assumption, of which the Negro people are especially fond, cannot be established by careful consideration of history. Okay, so this is saying, look, if the race is really the true history, then the sort of admixture is just sort of missing the point here. Okay. We find upon the world stage today 8 distinctly differentiated races in the sense in which history tells us the world must be used. They are the Slavs of Eastern Europe, the Teutons of Middle Europe, the English of Great Britain and America, the Romance nation of the Southern and Western Europe, the Negroes of Africa and America, the Semitic peoples of Western Asia and North Africa, the Hindus of Central Asia, and the Mongolians of Eastern Asia. There are, of course, other minor race groups as the American Indians, the Esquimaux, and the South Sea Islanders. These larger races, too, are far from homogeneous. The Slavs include the Czech, the Magyar, the Pole, and the Russian. The Teutons include the German, the Scandinavian, and the Dutch. The English include the Scotch, the Irish, and the conglomerate American. This is going to piss off a lot of people right here. Under Romance nations, the widely differing Frenchman, Italian, Sicilian, and Spaniard are comprehended. The term Negro is perhaps the most indefinite of all, combining the mulattoes and Zambos of America, the Egyptians, Bantus, and Bushmen of Africa. Among the Hindus are traces of widely differing nations, while the great Chinese, Tartar, Korean, and Japanese families fall under the one designation, Mongolian. Haven't seen this written of Korean in a while. Hi, King Air. Reading some W.E.B. Du Bois. If you have any questions, you let me know. The question now is, what is the real distinction between these nations? Is the physical differences of blood, color, and cranial measurements? Certainly we must acknowledge that physical differences play a great part, and that with wide exceptions and qualifications, these 8 great races of today follow the cleavage of physical race distinctions. The English and the Teuton represent the white variety of mankind, the Mongolian the yellow, the Negroes the black. Between these are many crosses and mixtures where Mongolian and Teuton have blended into the Slav, and the other mixtures have produced the Romance nations and the Semites. But while race differences have followed mainly physical race lines, yet no mere physical distinctions would really define or explain the deeper differences, the cohesiveness and continuity of these groups. The deeper differences are spiritual, psychical differences, undoubtedly based on the physical, but infinitely transcending them. The forces that bind together the Teuton nations are, then, their race identity and common blood, secondly, and more importantly, a common history, a common laws and religion, similar habits of thought, and a conscious striving together for certain ideals of life. The whole process which has brought about these race differentiations has been a growth, and a great characteristic of this growth has been the differentiation of spiritual and mental differences between the great races of mankind and the integration of physical differences. Okay, so this is actually the exact same strategy as above. It's one, Du Bois was talking here about the scientific sort of, or the hard science biology, like the physical characteristics. Then He was saying, look, you can slice it up many different ways, but none of those seem to matter. And then he's moved into sociology and history here, and then he's sort of doing the same thing here. The way you slice it up doesn't actually, like, everything's already been admixed, and that's not actually, the history and the sociology is not fixed among any of them, because you can keep mixing this stuff together, and you can't really reduce it to the history because something else is going on here. The age of nomadic tribes of closely related individuals represent the maximum of physical differences. They were practically vast families, and there were as many groups as families. As the families came together to form cities, the physical differences lessened, the purity of blood was replaced by the requirement of domicile, and all who lived within the city bounds became gradually to be regarded as members of the group. That is, there was a slight and slow breaking down of physical barriers. This, however, was accomplished by an increase of the spiritual and social differences between cities. This city became husbandmen, this merchants, and other warriors, and so on. The ideals of life for which the different cities struggled were different. When at last cities began to coalesce into nations, there was another breaking down of barriers which separated groups of men. The larger and broader differences of color, hair, and physical proportions were not by any means ignored, but myriads of minor differences disappeared, and the sociology and historical races of men began to approximate the present division of races indicated by physical researchers. At the same time, the spiritual and physical differences of race groups which constituted the nations became deep and decisive. The English nation stood for constitutional liberty and commercial freedom, the German nation for science and philosophy, the Romance nations stood for literature and art, and the other race groups are striving, each in its own way, to develop for civilization its particular message, its particular ideal, which shall help to guide the world nearer and nearer to that perfection of human life for which we all long, that one far-off divine event. This has been the function of race differences up to the present time. What shall be its function in the future? Manifestly, some of the great races today, particularly the Negro race, have not as yet given to civilization the full spiritual message which they are capable of giving. I will not say that the Negro race has yet given no message to the world, for it is still a mooted question among scientists as to just how far Egyptian civilization was Negro in its origin. If it was not wholly Negro, it was certainly very closely allied. Be that as it may, however, the fact still remains that the full, complete Negro message of the whole Negro race has not yet been given to the world, that the message and ideal of the yellow race have not been completed, and that the striving of the mighty Slavs has but begun. The question is, then, how shall this message be delivered? How shall these various ideals be realized? The answer is plain. By the development of these race groups, not as individuals, but as races. For the development of Japanese genius, Japanese literature and art, Japanese spirit, only Japanese bound and welded together, Japanese inspired by one vast ideal, can work out in its fullness the wonderful message which Japan has for the nations of the earth. For the development of Negro genius, of Negro literature and art, of Negro spirit, only Negroes bound and welded together, Negroes inspired by one vast ideal, can work out in its fullness and the great message we have for humanity. We cannot reverse history, we are subject to the same natural laws as other races, and if the Negro is ever to be a factor in the world history, if among gaily colored banners that deck the broad ramparts of civilization, to hang on one uncompromising black, then it must be placed there by black hands, fashioned by black heads, and hallowed by the travail of 2,000,000 black hearts beating in one glad song of jubilee. Okay, so this is still taking the tack that race is in some sense a historical fundamental, even though there's no guarantee that you're going to have no admixture. So it's kind of an interest. Like, the question is, why at that point do we look to race as the historical important thing? Now, there was a sort of this proto-history of like building up things from like groups to like areas to like to cities to like nation states to like nations, and then in sort of this all sort of comes together in one sort of grand teleological thing. But again, race is the thing that's sort of tying it together. And I'm not sure that that was really established here, but I mean, it, like, in some sense, so what? I mean, you can still just do it and see where you go. For this reason, the advance guard of the Negro people, the 8 million people of Negro blood in the United States of America, must soon come to realize that if they are to take their just place in the vast pan-Negroism, then their destiny is not absorption by the white Americans. That if America is to be proven for the first time in the modern world that not only Negroes are capable of evolving individual men like Toussaint, the Savior, but are a nation stored with wonderful possibilities of culture, then their destiny is not a servile imitation of Anglo-Saxon culture, but a stalwart originality which shall unswervingly follow Negro ideals. It may, however, be objected here that the situation of our race in America renders this attitude impossible, that our sole hope of salvation lies in our being able to lose our race identity in the commingled blood of the nation, and that any other course would merely increase the friction of races which we call race prejudice, and against which we have so long and earnestly fought. Yeah, it's like if you're going to go for like a separatist thing, then you're going to cause national, like, the problem within the nation if you're supposed to be one nation. All right. Here then is the dilemma, and it is a puzzling one, I admit. No Negro who has given earnest thought to the situation of his people in America has failed at some time in life to find himself at these crossroads, has failed to ask himself at some time, what, after all, am I? Am I American or am I Negro? Can I be both? Or is it my duty to cease to be a Negro as soon as possible and be an American? If I strive as a Negro, am I not perpetuating the very cleft that threatens and separates black and white America? Is it not my only possible practical aim, the subduction of all that is Negro in me to the American? Does my black blood place upon me any more obligation to assert my nationality than German or Irish or Italian blood would? Is this right? Is it rational? Is it good policy? Have we in America a distinct mission as a race, a distinct sphere of action, and an opportunity for race development, or is self-obliteration the highest end to which Negro blood dare aspire? If we carefully consider what race prejudice really is, we find it, historically, to be nothing but the friction between different groups of people. It is the difference in aim and feeling and ideals of two different races. If now this difference exists touching territory, laws, language, or even religion, it is manifest that these people cannot live in the same territory without fatal collision. But if, on the other hand, there is substantial agreement in laws, language, and religion, if there is a satisfactory adjustment of economic life, then there is no reason why in the same country and on the same street, two or three great national ideals might not thrive and develop, that men of different races might not strive together for their race ideals as well, perhaps even better, than in isolation. Here, it seems to me, is the reading of the riddle that puzzles so many of us. We are Americans not only by birth and by citizenship, but by our political ideals, our language, and our religion. Farther than that, our Americanism does not go. But at that point, we are Negroes, members of a vast historic race that from the very dawn of creation has slept, but half awakening in the dark forest of its African fatherland. We are the first fruits of this new nation, the harbinger of that black tomorrow which is yet destined to soften the whiteness of the Teutonic today. We are the people whose subtle sense of song has given America its only American music. Yeah, this is my grandma always said. She was like, I love black people, they gave us all of our music. She's like, this is the best thing America ever did. This is black music. Among other things we've done, but she said the music the black folk here, she always was like very complimentary on that. I was like, all right, whatever you say, Grandma. It's only American music, it's only American fairy tales, it's only touch of pathos and humor amid its mad money-getting plutocracy. Wow, how little changes. As such, it is our duty to conserve our physical powers, our intellectual endowments, our spiritual ideals. As a race, we must strive by race organization, by race solidarity, by race unity, to the realization of that broader humanity which freely recognizes differences in men, but sternly deprecates inequality in their opportunities of development. For the accomplishment of these ends, we need race organizations, Negro colleges, Negro newspapers, Negro business organizations, a Negro school of literature and art, and an intellectual clearinghouse for all these products of the Negro mind, which we may call a Negro Academy. Not only, so he's just very, Du Bois was very, school building. Not only is all this necessary for positive advance, it is absolutely imperative for negative defense. Let us not deceive ourselves that our situation our situation in this country, weighted with a heritage of moral inequity from our past, hard pressed in the economic world by foreign immigrants and native prejudice, hated here, despised there, and pitied everywhere. Our one haven of refuge is ourselves, but one means of advance, our own beliefs in our great destiny, our own implicit trust in our abilities and worth. There is no power under God's high heaven that can stop the advance of 8,000 honest, earnest, inspired, and united people. But, and here is the rub, they must be honest, fearlessly criticizing their own faults, zealously correcting them. They must be earnest. No people that laughs at itself and ridicules itself and wishes to God it was anything but itself ever wrote its name in history. It must be inspired with the divine faith of our black mothers, that out of the blood and dust of battle we will march a victorious host, a mighty nation, a peculiar people, to speak to the nations of earth a divine truth that shall make them free. And such a people must be united, not merely united for the organized theft of political spoils, not united to disgrace religion with whoremongers and ward healers, not united merely to protest and pass resolutions, but united to stop the ravages of consumption among the Negro people, united to keep black boys from loafing, gambling, and crime, united to guard the purity of black women and to reduce that vast army of black prostitutes that today is marching to hell, and united in serious organizations to determine by careful conference and thoughtful interchange of opinion the broad lines of policy and action for the American Negro. This is the reason for being which the American Negro Academy has. It aims at once to be the epitome and expression of the intellect of the black-blooded people of America, the exponent of the race ideals of one of the world's great races. As such, the Academy must, if successful, be a representative in character, impartial in contract, firm in leadership. All right, so we've shifted down. Now, instead of this sort of from the position, it's sort of a teleological view of things. So how do you, once you've built up this sort of teleology of how things are in the world, then what do you do about it? And this shift here just came in and said, look, how do you do that? Well, you have to be focused, basically. Just focus, discipline. And how do you do that? Well, you have to be stalwart or unswervingly follow Negro ideals. So in doing so, like, how do you get this way? Now you're sort of like nation building, like academy building. In the teleological sort of sense of things, this makes a lot of sense. Question is, do you buy the teleological picture above? People disagree. I wasn't sold on the argument, but like it's not a bad argument. So I mean it had a lot of effect in the history of this country. So the question is, of course, then you could do the relativism, like, wasn't it, maybe it's not directed at me or like people now, it was directed at people 100 years ago or 130 years ago, whenever this was written, 120 years ago. So alright, well, continuing, that's just the question of what do you do when you're in a teleological system? And it's like, well, then you start world building. It must be representative in character, not that it represents all interests or all factions, but in that it seeks to comprise something of the best thought, the most unselfish striving, and the highest ideals. There are scattered and forgotten nooks and corners throughout the land, Negroes of some considerable training, of high minds and high motives, who are unknown to their fellows, who exert far too little influence. These the Negro Academy should strive to bring into touch with each other and to give them a common mouthpiece. The Academy should be impartial in conduct while it aims to exalt the people. It should aim to do so by truth, not by lies, by honesty, not by flattery. It should continually impress the fact upon the Negro people that they must not expect to have things done for them, they must do for themselves, with all caps. That they have on their hands a vast work of self-reformation to do, and that a little less complaint and whining, and a little more dogged work and manly striving would do us more credit and benefit than 1,000 force or civil rights bills. Yeah, so this is a question exactly how far this will get you nowadays, but yeah, it's not to say hard work, of course, tends to pay off. Well, no, I don't know if hard work tends to pay off. It's better than no work. You have to do something. You can't expect to just get lucky. Finally, the American Negro Academy must point out a practical path of advance to the Negro people. There lie before every Negro today hundreds of questions of policy and right which must be settled, and which each one settles now, not in accordance with any rule, but by impulse or individual preference. For instance, what should be the attitude of Negroes toward the educational qualification for voters? What should be our attitudes toward separate schools? How should we meet discriminations on railways and in hotels? Such questions need not so much specific answers for each part as a general expression of policy, and nobody should be better fitted to announce such a policy than a representative, honest Negro Academy. Okay, so this is sort of laying out how they want their people to be, so sometimes there's a personal sort of educational policy here, and how the sort of person that they want their people to be in this country. So that's an interesting thing. All this, however, must come in time after careful organization and long conference. The immediate work before us should be practical and have direct bearing upon the situation of the Negro. The historical work of collecting the laws of the United States and the various states of the Union with regard to the Negro is a work of such magnitude and importance that nobody but one like this could think of undertaking it. If we could accomplish that one task, we would justify our existence. Yeah, well, nowadays you just can search the computers, but yeah, compiling all the racist laws in this country would take a long time, even back then. In the field of sociology, an appalling work lies before us. First, we must unflinchingly and bravely face the truth, not with apologies, but with solemn earnestness. The Negro Academy ought to sound a note of warning that would echo in every black cabin in the land. Yeah, sure. This is King Air, if you type, I don't know if you were here before, but here's the text. So if you want to take a look, you can see the page numbers on the sort of the right. So if you want to follow along, this is a free text. This is a classic work from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an American civil rights and philosopher, writer, and did a lot of things at the start of the 1900s, well, mostly last century and before. So, just reading this as to, it's just been in the news very recently with all the trouble in America, so why not? Alright, so, yeah, so you can just follow along if you want. But yeah, this is well written, so this is if you want to read something, this is good to read. Alright, so the Negro Academy ought to sound a note of warning that would echo in every black cabin in the land. Unless we conquer our present vices, they will conquer us. We are diseased, we are developing criminal tendencies, and an alarming percentage of our men and women are sexually impure. It's a very conservative sort of thing. Now, in some sense, if you're going to be nation building, you have to sort of put hard limits on things, but it's a question of exactly what sort of nation you're building with this sort of understanding of the world. The Negro Academy should stand and proclaim this over the housetops, crying with garrison, I will not equivocate, I will not retreat a single inch, I will be heard. The Academy should seek to gather about it the talented, unselfish men, the pure and noble-minded women, to fight an army of devils that disgraces our manhood and our womanhood. There does not stand today upon God's earth a race more capable in muscle, in intellect, and morals than the American Negro, and if he will bend his energies in the right direction, if he will burst his birth's invidious bar and grasp the skirts of happy chance, and breast the blows of circumstance, and grapple with his evil star. Alright, so yeah, again, I get a little worried. Whose morals are you taking on sometimes? Granted, you have to do something, but whose exactly morals are you taking when you are starting this? Because you don't want to be getting the wrong morals for the people that you're dealing with. I mean, sometimes some of these things might not be so bad in the long run. I don't know. I'm not telling people how to be. In science and morals, I have indicated two fields of work for the Academy. Finally, in practical policy, I wish to suggest the following Academy creed. 1. We believe that the Negro people as a race have a contribution to make to civilization and humanity which no other race can make. We believe it the duty of the Americans of Negro descent as a body to maintain their race identity until this mission of the Negro people is accomplished and the ideal of human brotherhood has become a practical possibility. 3. We believe that unless modern civilization is a failure, it is entirely feasible and practicable for two races in such essential political, economic, and religious harmony as the white and colored people of America to develop side by side in peace and mutual happiness, and the peculiar contribution which each has to make to the culture of their common country. As a means to this end, we advocate not such social equality between these races as would disregard human taste and dislike, but such a social equilibrium as would, throughout all the complicated relations of life, give due and just consideration to culture, ability, and moral worth, whether they can be found under white or black skins. So I like this. This is a nice statement of colorblind is not the way he's going here. So he says you have to take into consideration all the differences, but that doesn't mean you have to. But colorblind is not right. 5. We believe that the first and greatest step towards the settlement of the present friction between the races, commonly called the Negro problem, lies in the correction of the immorality, crime, and laziness among the Negroes themselves, which still remains as a heritage from slavery. We believe that only earnest and long-continued efforts on our own part can cure these social ills. I don't know if this is by that one, but I'll take his word for it. That's what he says. 6. We believe that the second great step towards a better adjustment of the relations between the races should be a more impartial selection of ability in the economic and intellectual world. Still trying to work on these things now. It doesn't seem to be easy. And a greater respect for the personal liberty and worth regardless of race. We believe that only earnest efforts on the part of the white people of this country will bring much needed reform in these matters. So yeah, this still seems to be the opinion nowadays. It's not the black people that are being are wrong in this case. It's the white people that are wrong in this case. 7. On the basis of the foregoing declaration and the firmly believing in our high destiny, we as American Negroes are resolved to strive in every honorable way for the realization of the best and highest aims, for the development of strong manhood and pure womanhood, and for the rearing of a race ideal in America and Africa to the glory of God and the uplifting of the Negro people. W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, so I can see why this is famous, because it really does lay out a sort of a vision for, given the status of things in the world, how can we sort of, what is there to be done? So it's very pragmatic. This is basically this would be like philosophy of education nowadays, is the sort of paper that I've seen, like other papers of this sort. This would fall under this is written mostly for like philosophy of education. You start by surveying sort of the best science of the day and the best sort of like historical gloss you can put on things and say, well, what do we do about that? Now, this is a bit teleological, more teleological than I would like, but that doesn't really matter what I like. But like, if you're going to be in this sort of teleological thing where you've got like sort of a historical unfolding of things, and this is how things have been, and we're going to be in this great tradition, and how do we do that? What do we do at that point? And so the argument up here in the sort of is breaking down any specific. So what happened here in the first part of the essay is it's in this teleological tradition. It's breaking down any specific thing that could sort of get in the way of a grand vision. It says there is no physical thing, there is no like historical thing. It's just that this is how the history is, and it's in this great progression. So you knock out any sort of like stumbling block there, and at that point it becomes a question of just self-motivation, and that's where we go after this. And then how do you sort of, what should we be motivated to do? So you get this in philosophy of education. This is how things have been. This is how we should be constructing the education to best provide for the next generation and the people we want to be in the future. So that's kind of how I'm seeing this. And of course it basically just says American Negro Academy. So it's, of course, for an academy is educating the next generation and also to set the standards for today, as it were. So then we've got this stuff. Now, some of the questions, like I said I had, is exactly whose morals are you taking on at this point to do this stuff? Because you're going to, I think it's shown, like the systemic racism is shown that a lot of the sort of like big systems can't be trusted themselves either. So it's like you might take on some sort of ethics, but the ethics might not actually be as race friendly as you would like it to be. And if you take on some sort of economic models, a lot of times the economic models tend to support the people in power, especially a capitalist society. The capitalists often basically make things so good for capitalism, but that also tends to favor the people who already have a lot of money. So, I wouldn't say tends, it basically always favors the people with a lot of money. So this is kind of what I think's going on. If anybody out there has any questions, please let me know. Yeah, so I mean, if you're gonna start off with like the understanding of race, what then do we do? So okay, it was a good essay. Like I said, it's the oldest thing, and you got like this sort of older, slightly older English, which is interesting to read. Because yeah, in some sense, the rhetoric is slightly different, and you have to parse the older sort of way of thinking about things, and you don't want to be arguing against just the older sort of argument style. That's unimportant for the argument. You have to figure out what's going on. So it's just a side point about the rhetoric going on. How do you embed, like, how do you understand the embedded argument in older English? And I mean, if you go back and read Hume or somebody, it's much older, so you got the same problem. But it's when it's just slightly different like this from 100 years ago, then it's an interesting thing. It's like we don't talk about the Negro problem anymore. Okay, so that's it for now. I mean, I guess I don't want to do any more classic papers, and that has nothing to do with this one. I kind of like doing the other ones. It's like I send all the papers out on email too. Like I email the author, say, hey, you got a review. Who do I send the email to for this one? I have no idea. But okay. Yeah, so that's it for now. Hope everyone has a good day and stay safe out there. And I'll try and think of another, maybe I will do some philosophy of gender next. If anyone has anything to send me, please send me. Like a paper they want me to think would be fun for me to read. And have a good day. Bye-bye.